The jungle screamed with life, but Marcus heard something different. Something wrong. He pushed through the violet foliage of Kepler 442b, his rifle held low but ready. The distress beacon had died 3 hours ago, leaving him with nothing but instinct, and the fading coordinates burned into his helmet display. Standard protocols said to wait for backup. Marcus had never been good at following protocol. The screen came again, high and piercing, cutting through the humid air like broken glass. Not human. Not animal either. Something in between. Something that understood pain and feared death. Marcus broke into a run. The trees thinned ahead, opening into a clearing where firelight danced against the encroaching dusk. He dropped to a crouch at the tree line, his breath controlled despite the sprint. What he saw made his jaw clench. A girl hung suspended over a fire pit, bound to a crude spit that 2 large aliens cranked slowly. Her skin was pale blue, almost luminescent in the firelight, and her small frame couldn't have weighed more than 40 kilos. She was young, maybe the equivalent of 14 in human years, and her screams had turned to whimpers. Around the fire, a dozen tribal aliens chanted and stamped their feet. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies covered in thick brown fur and decorated with bones. Their faces were flat and broad, with too many teeth visible in their wide grins. They carried stone weapons and wore pelts, but Marcus knew better than to assume they were primitive. Evolution took many paths. The girl's eyes found him through the smoke. Large, golden, and filled with terror that transcended species. She tried to say something, but her voice cracked. Marcus counted the hostiles again. 12. Poor odds for a frontal assault. He checked his rifle charge. 70%. Enough. He aimed for the ropes first. The shot burned blue through the clearing, severing the bindings on the left side of the spit. The girl dropped, twisting away from the flames as the aliens roared in confusion. Marcus was already moving, firing twice more to scatter the group as he sprinted toward the fire. A stone axe whistled past his head. Another clipped his shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but he kept his feet. Training and adrenaline pushed him forward. He grabbed the girl as she struggled to free her remaining bound arm, yanked his combat knife free, and cut the rope in one motion. She collapsed against him, her skin hot from the fire, but alive. Alive was good enough. The tribals recovered quickly, forming a semicircle that blocked the path Marcus had used to enter. Their leader, distinguished by a headdress of bones and feathers, raised a spear and bellowed something that needed no translation. This human had stolen their meal. Marcus fired a burst over their heads. They flinched but didn't scatter. These weren't prey animals. They were hunters, and they knew when something was bluffing. The girl grabbed his arm, pointing to the right where the jungle grew thick and dark. Marcus nodded once, scooped her up despite her weak protest, and ran. The tribals followed. Marcus crashed through the undergrowth. The girl clutched tight against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel her rapid heartbeat through her thin clothing. Behind them, the hunting calls of the tribals echoed through the trees, growing closer. They knew this jungle. He didn't. His boot caught a root, and he stumbled, nearly dropping her. She squeaked in fear, but held on, her small hands gripping his tactical vest. He regained his balance and pushed harder, his lungs burning in the thin atmosphere. The ground dropped away suddenly. Marcus skidded to a halt at the edge of a ravine, loose stones tumbling into the darkness below. The sound of rushing water echoed up from somewhere deep in the shadows. Behind them, the tribals crashed closer, their calls triumphant. The girl looked at the ravine, then at Marcus. She said something in a language of whistles and clicks, then pointed down. Her golden eyes were steady now, the terror replaced with determination. Marcus looked at the drop. 30 meters, maybe more. Certain death if the water below was shallow or filled with rocks. Certain death if they stayed here too. He made the choice humans always made when backed into corners. He jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. The girl buried her face in his chest, her small form trembling. Wind roared past them, and Marcus twisted in the air, positioning himself to take the impact. The water hit like concrete, driving the air from his lungs and nearly tearing the girl from his grip. But he held on. They plunged deep, the current immediately grabbing them and pulling them downstream. Marcus kicked hard, fighting toward what he hoped was the surface. His lungs screamed. The girl had gone limp in his arms, and panic spiked through his oxygen-starved brain. They broke the surface together. Marcus gasped and immediately checked the girl. She coughed, spitting water, her eyes fluttering open. Relief flooded through him. The current carried them around a bend, away from the clearing and the tribals. Marcus spotted a sandbar ahead and kicked toward it, his arms leaden with exhaustion. They washed up on the rough sand, and he dragged them both fully onto land before collapsing. For long minutes, there was only the sound of their breathing and the rush of the river. The girl sat up first. She looked at Marcus, then reached out tentatively and touched his face, her expression filled with wonder. She said something soft in her clicking language, and though he didn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. "Thank you." Marcus nodded, still trying to catch his breath. His shoulder throbbed where the axe had hit, and his ribs felt bruised from the impact with the water, but he'd had worse. The girl had burns on her legs and arms, but nothing life-threatening if he could get her to the med station. She pointed at herself and said something that sounded like Lyra. "Marcus," he replied, tapping his chest. She tried to repeat it. The human sounds awkward in her mouth, but she smiled when she got close. It was the first time she'd smiled, and it transformed her face from terrified prey to something bright and hopeful. Marcus activated his emergency beacon. The signal was weak this deep in the jungle, but it would reach orbit eventually. They just had to survive until pickup arrived. Lyra stood on shaky legs, looking around the riverbank. She walked to a cluster of plants growing near the water and examined them carefully before picking several broad leaves. She brought them back to Marcus and gestured at his shoulder. He understood. Medical herbs, or this planet's equivalent. He nodded and let her apply them to his wound. Her hands were gentle, and the leaves had an immediate cooling effect that eased the pain. When she finished, she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Marcus didn't move away. The night was growing cold, and she was still shaking from shock and exposure. They sat like that as the moons rose, two beings from different worlds, sharing warmth and silence. Marcus thought about the tribals, about how easy it would have been to keep walking when he heard those screams. Mission parameters hadn't included rescue operations. His objective had been simple reconnaissance, nothing more. No one would have blamed him for playing it safe. But that wasn't what humans did. That wasn't what he did. Lyra's hand found his, small fingers wrapping around his calloused palm. She looked up at him with those golden eyes, and Marcus saw something there that went beyond gratitude. She saw him as something impossible, something that defied the brutal logic of her world. A stranger who ran toward screams instead of away from them. In the distance, a signal flare bloomed in the sky. Green, the all clear from his team. They'd received his beacon and were inbound. Relief washed over him. Lyra saw the flare and tensed, fear creeping back into her eyes. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Friends," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand, but hoping the tone would translate. "Good people?" She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She'd made one leap of faith tonight. What was another? The shuttle touched down 20 minutes later, its landing lights turning the jungle into a maze of harsh shadows. Marcus waved to the pilot, then helped Lyra to her feet. She limped beside him, still holding his hand, as they walked toward the light. The medic took one look at Lyra and immediately started treatment. Marcus tried to let go of her hand, but she held tight, panic in her eyes. He stayed with her through the examination, through the bandaging and the scanner readings, until she finally fell asleep from exhaustion and medication. The pilot, a woman named Torres, raised an eyebrow at Marcus. "You jumped off a cliff for her?" Marcus shrugged his good shoulder. "She needed help." Torres shook her head but smiled. "That's why they tell those stories about us, you know. Humans and their damn hero complexes." Marcus looked back at Lyra, sleeping peacefully for probably the first time in days. Her burns would heal. The psychological scars would take longer, but she was young and resilient. She'd make it. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe we just don't like the sound of screaming." The shuttle lifted off, carrying them away from the tribal lands and toward the colony where Lyra's family waited, where they'd been searching desperately since she disappeared during a gathering expedition 3 days ago. Marcus watched the jungle fall away beneath them, dark and vast and full of dangers, but also full of life worth saving. That was the thing about humans, he thought. They followed the screams. And sometimes, just sometimes, they got there in time.